Have you ever worried that your child might love someone else more than you? This billionaire father came home early from a business trip and overheard something that shattered his world. Contrary to what most people believe, the person giving his son the most love and attention wasn't the wealthy father who could buy anything. It was the black housekeeper he'd been taking for granted for months. I've studied hundreds of stories about working parents and childcare, but this one reveals a truth that will make every parent question their priorities. By the end of this story, you'll understand that sometimes the people we pay to care for our children end up loving them more than we do, and why one overheard conversation changed everything about how this family defined real parenthood. Ruby Thompson went from being an overlooked housekeeper to the woman a 5-year-old boy called his real mommy, proving that love isn't about biology or bank accounts. It's about who shows up every day. If you skip this story, you'll miss the moment that shows why presence matters more than presence and how one father learned that sharing love doesn't mean losing it. The Mitchell penthouse in Manhattan's Upper East Side was a testament to success and a monument to absence. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Central Park, while the minimalist decor spoke of a man who valued efficiency over warmth. Every surface was spotless, every piece of furniture precisely positioned, and every family photograph carefully arranged to project the image of a perfect life. But perfection, Daniel Mitchell had learned, was a poor substitute for presence. At 35, Daniel was a venture capitalist whose Midas touch had turned every investment into gold. His portfolio included 3 unicorn startups, 2 revolutionary biotech companies, and a social media platform that had redefined digital communication. Forbes had featured him on their cover twice, and Wall Street considered him one of the most influential investors of his generation. None of that mattered to his 5-year-old son Lucas, who barely knew the man who funded his life, but was rarely present to live it. Lucas Mitchell was a beautiful child with his mother's dark hair and his father's intelligent eyes, but grief had hollowed out his natural exuberance in ways that broke hearts and concerned child psychologists. His mother Rebecca had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving behind a husband drowning in work to avoid processing loss, and a son who had learned that loving people meant risking devastating abandonment. In the 24 months since Rebecca's death, Daniel had hired 7 different nannies, each carefully vetted through exclusive agencies that catered to Manhattan's elite families. The women who came to care for Lucas possessed impressive credentials degrees from prestigious universities, certifications in child development, references from celebrities and politicians who trusted them with their most precious responsibilities. But Lucas rejected them all with the systematic determination of a child who had decided that forming attachments was too dangerous to risk. Mrs. Blackwell, with her British accent and Norland College training, had lasted 3 months before Lucas's deliberate defiance drove her to seek a more suitable position. Miss Chen, who spoke 4 languages and held a master's degree in early childhood education, had endured 6 weeks of Lucas's polite but complete emotional withdrawal before admitting defeat. The pattern was always the same. Lucas would comply with rules, eat his meals, complete his activities, and maintain the kind of perfect behavior that worried child psychologists more than tantrums would have. He was a ghost child, physically present but emotionally unreachable, going through the motions of childhood without experiencing any of its joy. Daniel watched this progression with the helpless frustration of a man who could solve billion-dollar problems but couldn't reach his own son. Every failed nanny felt like evidence of his inadequacy as a father, proof that losing Rebecca had somehow broken his ability to provide the family stability that Lucas desperately needed. Ruby Thompson arrived on a rainy Thursday morning carrying nothing but a worn canvas bag and the kind of quiet confidence that came from 20 years of working with children. She was 42 years old, with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a life spent in service to others. Her resume was modest compared to her predecessors, a high school diploma, 15 years as a preschool teacher in Brooklyn, and recent experience as a housekeeper for families who needed someone reliable rather than impressive. Daniel had hired her almost reluctantly, influenced more by his housekeeper agency's desperation than by Ruby's qualifications. 7 failed nannies in 2 years had made the Mitchell household somewhat notorious among Manhattan's domestic staffing companies, and Ruby was the only candidate willing to take on what others had begun calling an impossible situation. "I should warn you," Daniel had told her during their brief interview. "Lucas is complicated. He doesn't warm up to new people, and he's been through a lot of changes recently. I travel frequently for business, so you'll essentially be managing his entire daily routine." Ruby had nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than concerned. "Children who have experienced loss need time and patience," she'd said simply. "Sometimes they just need someone who's willing to love them without expecting anything back." Daniel had been struck by her use of the word love in what he considered a professional arrangement. The previous nannies had spoken about structure education development and behavioral management. None of them had mentioned love as part of their job description. But Lucas had been through enough disruption, and Daniel's upcoming investor meetings in Silicon Valley meant he needed someone to start immediately. Ruby Thompson might not have the credentials of her predecessors, but she was available, willing, and patient enough to accept Lucas's emotional distance without taking it personally. What Daniel didn't know was that Ruby understood childhood grief from the inside. She'd lost her own son David to leukemia when he was 6 years old. The experience had destroyed her marriage and sent her into a depression so deep that she'd had to leave teaching for 5 years while she learned how to live with a loss that felt unsurvivable. Working with other people's children had been part of her healing process, a way to honor David's memory while channeling her maternal instincts toward children who needed what she had to give. She had learned that love wasn't diminished by being shared, and that sometimes the greatest gift you could offer a grieving child was the presence of someone who understood that healing happened slowly, quietly, and without pressure. Ruby's first day with Lucas began the way all the others had, with polite distance and careful observation. But unlike her predecessors, Ruby didn't try to engage Lucas with educational activities or structured play. Instead, she simply went about the business of creating a home environment that felt safe and stable. She hummed while she folded laundry. She talked to Lucas about ordinary things without expecting responses. She prepared his meals with the kind of attention that turned simple sandwiches into expressions of care. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lucas began to watch her with something that looked like hope. Ruby's approach to caring for Lucas was so different from her predecessors that it took Daniel weeks to understand what he was witnessing. Instead of implementing structured educational activities or behavioral modification programs, Ruby simply lived alongside Lucas, with the natural rhythm of someone who understood that childhood healing happened through relationship rather than curriculum. She didn't try to replace Rebecca or position herself as Lucas's new mother. Instead, she became something the boy had never experienced, the stable, loving presence who showed up every day without agenda or expectation, offering the kind of consistent care that children need to feel safe in the world. How many of us remember the adults who made us feel truly seen and valued? Ruby had the gift of making Lucas feel like the most important person in any room, not through grand gestures or expensive activities, but through the simple act of paying attention to who he was rather than who she thought he should become. Lucas began each day finding Ruby in the kitchen where she prepared breakfast while humming melodies that seemed to wrap around him like a warm blanket. She didn't bombard him with questions about his sleep or plans for the day. Instead, she would smile and say, "Good morning, sweet boy. I made your favorite pancakes because Tuesday seems like a pancake kind of day." These small acknowledgments that she'd noticed his preferences, that she'd thought about what might make him happy, that his presence in the kitchen mattered to her, began to chip away at the walls Lucas had built around his heart. Ruby's background as a preschool teacher had taught her to read the subtle signs that indicated a child's emotional state. She noticed that Lucas was happiest during unstructured time, when he could choose his own activities. She observed that he was particularly drawn to building projects that allowed him to create and control small worlds. Most importantly, She recognized that his polite compliance masked a deep fear of disappointing adults who might then abandon him. Instead of pushing Lucas towards social interaction or emotional expression, Ruby focused on creating an environment where he felt safe to simply exist. She built blanket forts in the living room and left them up for days. She started elaborate art projects that could be worked on gradually over time. She read stories aloud while Lucas played nearby, not requiring him to sit still or participate, but offering the comfort of her voice and presence. The transformation began so gradually that Daniel almost missed it. Lucas started lingering in the rooms where Ruby was working. He began asking quiet questions about her activities. Most remarkably, he started volunteering information about his own thoughts and feelings without being prompted. "Ruby," Lucas said one morning while she folded laundry, "do you think my mom can see me from heaven?" Ruby paused in her folding, recognizing the profound trust that Lucas was placing in her by asking such a vulnerable question. "I think she can," Ruby replied gently, "and I think she's very proud of what a kind, smart boy you're growing up to be." Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like. Lucas confessed, his small voice barely audible. "That's okay, baby," Ruby said, sitting down to be at his eye level. "Love doesn't live in our memory of voices. It lives in our hearts, and that never goes away." These conversations became the foundation of their relationship, moments of genuine connection, where Lucas felt safe to express the grief and confusion that he'd been carrying alone for 2 years. Ruby never tried to fix his sadness or rush him through his healing process. Instead, she simply witnessed his feelings with the kind of acceptance that allowed him to begin processing his loss. Comment below if you've ever had someone in your life who made you feel completely accepted just as you were. There's something magical about people who love us without trying to change us, isn't there? As weeks turned into months, Lucas began referring to Ruby as Mama Ruby when they were alone together. The title emerged naturally, without discussion or ceremony, as his way of acknowledging that she was providing something essential that had been missing from his life. Ruby treasured these moments while also feeling a growing concern about Daniel's reaction if he knew how their relationship was developing. She'd worked for enough wealthy families to understand that emotional boundaries were often strictly maintained between staff and children, and she worried that Daniel might see Lucas's attachment as inappropriate or threatening. But Ruby couldn't bring herself to discourage the connection that was clearly healing Lucas's wounded spirit. For the first time since his mother's death, the little boy was laughing, genuinely engaging with activities enthusiastically, and showing the kind of emotional growth that all his previous caregivers had failed to inspire. Daniel noticed the changes in his son during his brief moments at home between business trips. Lucas seemed lighter, more animated, and remarkably well-adjusted for a child who had been struggling with severe grief-related behavioral issues. The transformation was so dramatic that Daniel had initially worried Lucas might be suppressing his emotions rather than processing them. "How is he doing?" Daniel asked Ruby during one of their brief check-ins before another business trip. "He's doing beautifully," Ruby replied, her voice warm with genuine affection. "He's starting to trust that people can stay in his life, and that's allowing him to open his heart again." Daniel felt a complex mixture of relief and something that might have been jealousy. He was grateful that Lucas was finally healing, but he couldn't ignore the fact that his son's breakthrough had come through his relationship with Ruby rather than with his own father. The truth was that Daniel's grief over Rebecca's death had made him emotionally unavailable to Lucas in ways that work demands couldn't fully explain. Throwing himself into his career had been his way of avoiding the devastating reality that Rebecca was gone and that he was now solely responsible for raising their son. Ruby's success with Lucas forced Daniel to confront his own failures as a father, and that recognition was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Every report of Lucas's progress felt like evidence of Daniel's inadequacy, proof that his son needed something Daniel didn't know how to provide. What Daniel didn't understand was that Lucas's healing wasn't a rejection of his father's love, it was preparation for being able to receive it. Ruby wasn't replacing Daniel in Lucas's heart, She was helping him develop the emotional capacity to love and trust again. But that understanding would only come after a moment of discovery that would challenge everything Daniel thought he knew about parenthood, love, and the meaning of family. Daniel's flight from San Francisco landed 3 hours early due to favorable winds and efficient air traffic control. Instead of calling ahead, he decided to surprise Lucas with an early return from what had been a particularly successful series of investor meetings. For once, he was coming home with good news and the rare luxury of an unscheduled evening to spend with his son. The penthouse was quiet when Daniel entered, his key turning silently in the well-oiled lock. Soft afternoon light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he could hear the distant sounds of Lucas playing in the living room. Daniel smiled, anticipating his son's excitement at seeing him home unexpectedly early. What he heard next stopped him cold in the marble foyer. "Mama Ruby, will you always live with us?" Lucas's voice carried the kind of innocent vulnerability that made Daniel's breath catch, but it was the next words that shattered his understanding of his own family. "I hope so, sweet boy." Ruby's voice replied, warm with the kind of tenderness that Daniel remembered Rebecca using with Lucas. "You know I love you very much." "I love you too, Mama Ruby," Lucas said, and Daniel could hear the smile in his son's voice. "You're like my real mommy now. Not like the other ladies who came and left. You're the one who stays and takes care of me and loves me even when I'm sad." This is the moment that changes everything. "Are you ready?" Daniel felt like he'd been punched in the chest. His son, his biological son, the child he'd been working 60-hour weeks to provide for, was calling another woman his real mommy. The woman he'd hired to provide childcare had somehow become the primary emotional attachment in Lucas's life. Daniel's initial reaction was a mixture of rage, jealousy, and profound hurt. He'd been killing himself with work demands, traveling constantly to build the financial security that would give Lucas every advantage, and his son had essentially replaced him with the help. He stood in the foyer for several minutes, listening to Ruby and Lucas continue their conversation about bedtime stories and tomorrow's plans, hearing the easy intimacy of their relationship, and feeling like an intruder in his own home. When Daniel finally walked into the living room, his expression must have revealed his emotional state, because Ruby immediately stood up from where she'd been sitting on the floor with Lucas, her face showing the kind of apprehension that came from recognizing imminent conflict. "Daddy!" Lucas exclaimed, running to hug Daniel with genuine excitement. "You're home early. Mama Ruby and I were building a castle for my dinosaurs. Do you want to see?" The innocent joy in Lucas's voice only intensified Daniel's internal turmoil. His son was happy, genuinely, radiantly happy, and that happiness was centered around a woman who wasn't his mother and wasn't his father. "Lucas, go wash your hands for dinner," Daniel said, his voice controlled, but clearly strained. "I need to speak with Ruby privately." Lucas looked between the two adults, his 5-year-old intuition picking up on the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "Is everything okay, Daddy?" "Everything's fine," Daniel lied. "Go ahead and wash up." After Lucas left the room, Daniel turned to Ruby with an expression that was carefully controlled but clearly furious. "I think we need to discuss some boundaries." Ruby straightened her shoulders, recognizing that this conversation had been inevitable since the day Lucas first called her Mama Ruby. "Mr. Mitchell, I know you heard what Lucas said. I want you to know that I never encouraged him to..." "To what?" Daniel interrupted, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "To call you his real mommy. To essentially replace me and his mother with the housekeeper." Ruby's eyes flashed with something that looked like controlled anger. "Replace you, Mr. Mitchell? When was the last time you spent an entire day with your son? When was the last time you read him a bedtime story, or helped him with a project, or just sat with him when he was sad?" The questions hit Daniel like physical blows because he couldn't answer them. His work schedule had consumed his life so completely that he couldn't remember the last time he'd had an uninterrupted day with Lucas. "I'm working to provide for him," Daniel said defensively. "Everything I do is for his future, for his security." "But what about his present?" Ruby asked, her voice gentler now but still firm. "Mr. Mitchell, Lucas is 5 years old. He doesn't need financial security as much as he needs emotional security. He doesn't need someone working for his future as much as he needs someone present for his today. Daniel felt his anger beginning to crack, revealing the guilt and grief that he'd been avoiding for 2 years. "So, you're saying I'm a terrible father?" "I'm saying you're a grieving father," Ruby replied, her voice full of compassion rather than accusation. "You lost Rebecca too, and you've been running from that pain by throwing yourself into work. But Lucas needed someone to help him process his grief, and since you weren't available to do that, he attached to someone who was." The truth of her words was devastating and undeniable. Daniel had been so focused on avoiding his own pain that he'd abdicated his emotional responsibilities to his son. "He called you his real mommy." Daniel whispered the words, feeling like admitting a failure too profound to bear. Ruby moved closer, her expression shifting from defensive to deeply empathetic. "Mr. Mitchell, when a child says something like that, it's not about biology or replacement. It's about recognition. Lucas recognizes love when he feels it, and he recognizes presence when he experiences it. He's not rejecting you, he's just acknowledging that I've been the one showing up for his emotional needs." "So what am I supposed to do?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking. "How do I compete with someone who's actually good at this?" "You don't compete," Ruby said firmly. "You participate. Lucas doesn't need you to be perfect, Mr. Mitchell. He just needs you to be present. He needs you to be his daddy, not his provider. He needs your love, not your money." At that moment, Lucas appeared in the doorway, having finished washing his hands. He looked between the two adults with the kind of perceptive concern that children develop when they live in households with complicated emotions. "Are you and Mama Ruby fighting because of me?" he asked, his small voice filled with the kind of self-blame that broke both adults' hearts. Daniel knelt down to Lucas's eye level, seeing his son clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "No, buddy. We're not fighting because of you. We're talking about how much we both love you and want to take better care of you." Lucas looked between them again, then said something that would replay in Daniel's mind for years to come. "Daddy, you don't have to be sad about Mama Ruby loving me. There's enough love for everybody. Mama Ruby taught me that love gets bigger when you share it, not smaller." In that moment, Daniel finally understood what Ruby had been trying to tell him. Lucas's attachment to her wasn't a rejection of his father. It was evidence that he'd learned how to love and trust again. And that capacity for love could extend to Daniel too, if he was willing to show up for it. 6 months later, the Mitchell penthouse had been transformed from a showcase of success into an actual home. Daniel had restructured his entire approach to work and parenting, turning down travel opportunities that would take him away from Lucas for more than 2 days and scheduling his most important meetings around school pickup times and bedtime stories. Ruby's role had evolved from housekeeper to family coordinator, a position that officially recognized what had been true all along. She was an essential part of Lucas's emotional support system and increasingly of Daniel's education in how to be present for his son. The three of them had developed a co-parenting relationship that worked beautifully for Lucas, who now had both his father's love and Ruby's nurturing presence anchoring his daily life. Daniel had learned that sharing parental responsibilities didn't diminish his importance to Lucas. It actually strengthened their bond by removing the pressure and guilt that had been interfering with their connection. Lucas still called Ruby Mama Ruby, but now he also sought out daddy time with an enthusiasm that filled Daniel's heart. Their evening routine included stories read by Daniel, songs sung by Ruby, and conversations that helped Lucas process his days with the support of two adults who genuinely loved him. The arrangement had raised eyebrows among Daniel's social circle, where traditional family structures and clear employer-employee boundaries were the norm. But Daniel had learned that unconventional families could be the most loving ones, and that Lucas's well-being was more important than social expectations. Which moment taught you the most about what love really means? Share your story in the comments, because sometimes the most profound lessons come from the smallest voices in our lives. Ruby Thompson proved something every working parent needs to remember. Children don't need perfect families, they need loving ones. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared among multiple caregivers. It multiplies, creating stronger foundations for children to build their lives upon. Daniel Mitchell learned that presence is the greatest present you can give a child, and that sometimes the people we hire to help our families end up becoming family themselves. If Ruby and Lucas's story touched your heart and you'd like to hear more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Every week I share stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Until next time, remember, family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to love you unconditionally, show up consistently, and help you become the best version of yourself.